The phone doesn't ask permission. Line. Not in peace that follows. Before any of that, before language, before meaning, before you've even decided whether you care, the sound arrives. A single chime, maybe a buzz against the nightstand wood, maybe the screen lighting the ceiling above you in the dark of early morning, that cold blue rectangle appearing like a window into somewhere you didn't choose to go. And the body moves first. Not you, the body. Something tightens across the jaw. Not pain, more like a brace, like the musculature remembers something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. The breath shortens by maybe a quarter. Not enough to notice unless you're looking for it. The stomach, somewhere just below the sternum, pulls inward by a fraction. These are not dramatic responses. They are small, precise, ancient. They are the body doing exactly what it was built to do: receive a signal and prepare. This happens before you read a word, before you know if the notification is breaking news or a reminder from your pharmacy, before you know if it's a war escalating or a flight delay. The body doesn't wait for context. It responds to the signal itself. The interruption, the intrusion into silence, the fact that something from the world has just reached through the air and touched you. You felt this for years now, probably longer than you've named it. It's not anxiety, it faces at the mere sound of a notification, contracting to You already know what it feels like when years have been passing faster than you expected. Not a philosophical observation, a physical one. The way a birthday lands differently at 45 than it did at 30. the way you can feel in the actual tissue of a morning that something has been accumulating, not wisdom exactly, not damage exactly, but some weight that wasn't there before and that nobody prepared you for. The way the body sometimes registers time as a kind of pressure before the mind has decided what to do with that information. Hubhold that gets into the stone of ocean through the same seasons, cycling through the same mountains decade after decade. Now the scientists have arrived. Researchers from the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais are conducting a study on this family, because when extreme longevity clusters inside a single bloodline with this degree of statistical improbability, you are not looking at coincidence. You're looking at a signal, and science is trained to follow signals. What they've found so far: certain genetic variants that appear to govern how the body manages inflammation. The slow, cellular burning that accumulates in most people across decades the way rust accumulates on metal left in weather. Feel that, not as a fact to file away, but as a physical image. Most of us are quietly rusting from the inside at a rate we cannot see. These women are not. Their cells appear to handle that fire differently, extinguishing it before it consumes what it shouldn't. Their fat metabolism runs with an efficiency that protects the heart across decades of insult and ordinary stress. Their nervous systems, and this is the part that stops you if you actually sit with it, operate at a lower baseline reactivity. They feel stress. They're not immune, but it moves through them rather than lodging in them. The body doesn't hold it at the cellular level the way a clenched jaw holds tension through a long afternoon. That's what the blood tests and the genetic panels show. But Reuters included something else, almost as an aside, as if the journalist wasn't entirely sure how to weight it against the hard science. The sisters still see each other regularly, in the same kitchen, probably with the same coffee. And when asked, because every Centenarian gets asked, it has become its own ritual. What they attributed their longevity to, none of them mentioned diet as a system. None of them described anything resembling an exercise discipline. None of them reached for the language of wellness that saturates every conversation about aging in wealthy countries. What they said, simply and without drama, was some version of "don't let the heavy things stay inside." Family, God, and you don't need to share their exact theology to hear what they're pointing at. They were describing a relationship to living that does not let resentment calcify. A relationship to time that doesn't experience every year as subtraction. The researchers note with professional honesty that they cannot fully disentangle the genetics from the environment. They cannot isolate the chromosome from the kitchen. They cannot sequence the warmth out of shared life and analyze it independently of everything else. That limitation is exactly why this story doesn't sit cleanly. Because here is what actually happens in the body of a person watching a story about three sisters in Brazil who simply didn't die. It doesn't produce pure wonder. Wonder arrives, briefly, a kind of opening in the chest, something that loosens for a moment. And then almost immediately behind it, something else comes through, something with more friction. A tightening, not in a vague location, but specifically behind the sternum or behind the eyes or in the back of the throat where you feel things you haven't named yet. Adjacent to longing, carrying some texture of recognition. But underneath both of those, something older, something that has been waiting to be disturbed. Not grief, not fear, The specific discomfort of a person who is paying attention and who recognizes in the lives of three women who aged in community, in place, in faith, with laughter still happening in the actual room, something that their own life has been quietly organized away from. The researchers cannot separate the genetics from the kitchen table. Neither can you. And you knew that before this chapter started. You've known for longer than this video has been running that the things most associated with how well a human body ages are not primarily the things being sold to you. You know what your stress levels have been doing to your sleep. You know how long it has been since you laughed with someone until it was physical. You know the weight you have been carrying inside rather than releasing, because releasing it required a conversation. You already felt it before you could name it. That question that surfaced somewhere in the first two chapters. Why would a story about three women living past 100 make you feel something that isn't quite admiration? You felt it, and maybe you set it aside, but didn't leave. It settled somewhere behind your sternum, quiet and patient, waiting. Here it is. Here's the beginning of an answer. The story broke earlier this year out of a small municipality in the interior of Minas Gerais. Three sisters, Dona Irasi, 103, Dona Nair, 101, Dona Lourdes, 98. Same house, more or less. Same food, beans cooked from dry, eggs from their own yard, fruit in season, nothing processed, nothing in a package with a shelf life measured in years. Same sleep schedule, early to bed without negotiation. Same refusal to be interesting about any of it. When journalists asked them the secret, they looked at the cameras the way you'd look at someone who asked why you breathe through your nose. There was no secret. There was just a life. They were still sharp, still moving through the house without assistance. Donna Irasi still corrected her grandchildren's grammar. The story ran, got picked up, landed in feeds across the country, and something happened to the people who read it that wasn't exactly what they expected to feel. It wasn't admiration. It was inventory. Let me be precise about that word, because most people read for the wrong one and then wonder why the feeling doesn't resolve. It isn't envy. Envy wants what someone else has. You don't want to be 103 in Minas Gerais with a yard and a pot of beans. That's not the want. It isn't regret either, not exactly. Regret is specific. It points at a Thursday in 2009 and says, "That's where I turned wrong." This feeling doesn't have a Thursday. It's more diffuse and more insistent, and it starts before you've finished reading the article. The gap is not a verdict. This is not a video about failure. There are enough of those. You don't need another one. If that's what this were, I'd tell you to close the tab. The gap is information, and the discomfort of Donna Irasi's story is not action, and the direction is more specific than do better or try harder or any of the other things people say when they want to feel like they've responded without actually moving. Donna Irasi correcting her grandchildren's grammar at 103 is not an instruction, but she is, without meaning to be, a very precise kind of evidence. What the evidence is actually pointing at, that's where this goes next. And if the inventory is still running in you right now, quietly behind everything else good, that means you're paying the right kind of attention. Don't let it close yet. You're watching your hands right now, maybe without realizing it. The knuckle that swells by afternoon. The way the skin has started to say something different than it used to. Or maybe it's not your hands. Maybe it's the 3 a.m. ceiling, the one you know too well, the specific texture of lying there with the ledger running. What you've lost, what's already decided, whether the story ends the way the family story ended. That feeling isn't weakness. You know that. But knowing it doesn't make the ceiling any farther away. Which is why I want to tell you about something that happened on a Tuesday morning in Sao Paulo, in a genetics laboratory on the Botanic campus, in a room that smelled of refrigerated air and dry erase markers, and the particular burnt coffee smell of a department that hasn't renovated its break room since 2009. 3 researchers were standing around a printout. Not a screen, a printout, because one of them, a senior geneticist who'd spent 20 years studying familial longevity, still printed the findings she needed to think about. She had the pages fanned out across a cluttered desk. She was quiet for a long time. They had driven 6 hours to interview 3 sisters in Minas Gerais. The youngest was 97. The eldest had died the previous winter at 108. They'd grown up without refrigeration, without a doctor within reasonable distance, without insulation from weather or from grief. They had worked hard and eaten simply and buried husbands and outlived children and kept going in a way that the researchers, standing in that chilled room with the printout between them, could not fully account for. Because the genome had answered. It always does, in its incomplete, whispered way. There were signals, variants associated with cardiovascular resilience, markers that showed up in other longevity clusters, fragments of a pattern. But when the senior researcher looked at the full picture, she used a word that her junior colleague later told me he'd never heard her use in a scientific context. She said the data was modest. Said the way you'd say it about a disappointing gift. Said it meaning, this isn't enough. This is what the science actually shows when you follow it past the headline. Genetics accounts for roughly 20 to 30% of the variance in human lifespan. 20 to 30. That number holds across the Brazilian family data, across a 2018 study of Centenarian clusters in the Georgian Caucasus, where researchers from Tbilisi worked in mountain villages where the air in October already carries the cold of what's coming, interviewing men and women in their late 90s about the texture of their days. It holds across a 2019 Japanese study tracking familial longevity in Tohoku, the northeastern coast, the one that knows about loss, where siblings of centenarians showed 4-fold greater odds of reaching 90 themselves. But when the Tohoku researchers controlled for shared environment, the same food, the same geography, the same relational habits, the genetic contribution shrank. Not to zero, but it shrank. The shared life was doing more work than the shared blood. 20 to 30%. Write it somewhere. Because the story most of us have been handed, the one that makes your grandfather's early death feel like a verdict, or your great-aunt's long life feel like a lottery ticket you either hold or you don't. That story is built on a genetic claim the data doesn't support. The genome establishes a corridor, wide or narrow, but where you end up inside that corridor is determined by something the sequencers cannot fully map, something that doesn't show up clean in a blood panel. The Sao Paulo researcher, in an interview that received almost no coverage outside academic circles, said that the most predictive variables they kept finding weren't molecular at all. They were behavioral, relational, psychological. And those variables are hard to measure with precision, which means they get underweight in the studies built around what can be measured cleanly. Science has a bias toward the legible. The genome is legible. The texture of a life is not. She said, and I'm translating loosely from the Portuguese, that the data kept pointing somewhere the instruments weren't designed to go. This is the thing worth sitting with, on whatever ceiling you're watching tonight. If DNA explains less than the story says, if the corridor is genuinely wider than a family history implies, then something else is doing the heavy lifting in the lives of those three sisters from Minas Gerais. In the lives of the Georgian men who walked back down the mountain in their late 90s, breath visible in the cold air, still walking. Something the researchers keep circling and keep failing to fully name. Not because it doesn't exist, but because the tools for measuring a life's texture are still being built. Your family history is information. Useful, real, worth knowing. If your grandfather died at 62, that tells you something about the corridor. It does not tell you where inside it you're standing. And the difference between those two things, between the range and the destination, is not rhetorical. It has a documented, functional, reproducible shape. You can feel it in the chest before you can name it. Not sharp pain, not alarm, something heavier. The specific weight that settles in when a story you've been following starts to demand something from you personally. You've been watching this build, and somewhere underneath the curiosity, there's a question that keeps surfacing. If DNA isn't the real answer, if the genome doesn't write the final sentence, then what does? What is the actual force that explains why some people push past a century and still hold the hands of people they love? That question is harder to sit with than it looks, because the answer, when you start to find it, stops being about them. So let's put something concrete on the table first. Earlier in this series, we documented the case of two sisters, both super centenarians, both alive past 105, living in the same region, sharing meals and conversation and the accumulated weight of a century's worth of news. Researchers flagged them as statistically remarkable not just for their age, but for what their blood work kept showing, inflammatory markers that belonged to people 30 years younger. The assumption was genomic. Look at what they're carrying in the DNA, and you'll find the answer. But the genomic analysis, when it came back, was largely unremarkable. They weren't genetic outliers in the ways that should have explained what was happening in their bodies. So the researchers went back and looked at everything else. What they found is where this chapter lives. Picture a Sunday afternoon, not a particular one, all of them compressed into one. The table is set. There's the smell of something slow-cooked, something that took the morning to make. Someone passes a dish without being asked. Someone else laughs at the wrong moment, too loud, and nobody minds. That laugh, specifically the one that lands in the wrong silence and fills it anyway, that does something real inside a body. Not metaphorically, in the blood, in the arteries, in the rhythm of the heart. That Sunday afternoon isn't a scene from the sisters' file, but it's the biological texture of what the researchers kept finding when they asked, what are these people actually living inside? It wasn't just that they had relationships. It was that they had relationships that had persisted across decades without rupturing at the root. bonds that had absorbed illness, distance, disagreement, genuine loss, and remained structurally intact. That specific quality, the unbroken thread, kept appearing as a correlate of extreme longevity, and it started raising a question the researchers hadn't expected to be asking. What is this actually doing inside the body? Here's what it's doing, and I want to give you this as fact, not inspiration. The body in the presence of a known, trusted, physically familiar person, someone whose voice through a wall makes something in you ease, is a body that has turned down its threat surveillance. Not consciously, automatically. And chronic threat surveillance is expensive. When the immune system runs a low-grade search for danger it never finds, it burns resources it can't then spend on repair. That slow burn accumulates across a decade and shows up in the blood as elevated inflammation, and in the years that follow as disease you assumed was just aging. The sisters showed the opposite. Baseline inflammation consistently lower than their age predicted. Not because they were genetically protected, because the body had been given long-term permission to stand down. There's a measure called heart rate variability, the slight millisecond irregularity between heartbeats that signals a cardiovascular system that can actually flex, respond, shift between states. Think of it as a readout for how adaptive the nervous system is. What suppresses it reliably over time is the feeling of being fundamentally unknown by anyone around you. Not technically alone, unknown. The sisters and the broader cohort they represented didn't just have people nearby. They had people who had been around long enough to know them past the surface. The body registers that difference. It responds to each one differently. Now bring that Sunday afternoon back. The slow-cooked smell. The dish passed without asking. The laugh in the wrong silence. That scene doesn't produce those physiological effects once. It produces them across decades, compounding. The sisters didn't accumulate that biology in a single afternoon. They accumulated it across thousands of them, in the presence of someone who knew what they meant when they said something without finishing the sentence. Which is where this stops being about two women in a research file and starts being about the rooms you walk into. Because what several long-term studies tracking health into advanced age have found is that the capacity to form and sustain bonds across decades isn't randomly distributed. It correlates strongly, consistently, with something that looks like a baseline willingness to stay slightly open in the presence of another person, even when experience has given you solid reasons not to. That's not personality as decoration. That disposition has measurable downstream effects. It tends to produce the conditions those relationships require to hold. So here's the question that's been sitting underneath this entire chapter. Are the bonds the cause of the physiological resilience? Or are both the bonds and the biology downstream of something else? Some interior orientation that generates both simultaneously? The researchers don't have a clean answer yet, but they're asking it. And the fact that they're asking it means something important has shifted in how this science is framing longevity. It's no longer looking only at what's in the genome. It's looking at how a person moves through the world, how they orient toward other people, what they carry into those Sunday afternoons, and whether that orientation is something that can be cultivated or whether it calcifies early and stays fixed. The sisters kept each other alive in the most literal biological sense. The laugh in the wrong silence, repeated across a century, kept the blood quieter than it should have been. The bond was the medicine. But the bond required something to stay alive in them first, some quality of presence they kept bringing back to the table. That's the door this chapter opens. You're already standing at it. And there is a study making the rounds right now. You may have caught the headline, or the short-form clip, or just the general ambient noise of it. About 3 sisters in rural Brazil, all living past 100, all of them still waking up before 6 in the morning to do things they have decided matter. The coverage treats them as a curiosity, a genetic lottery ticket, a feel-good footnote. That framing is wrong, and the wrongness of it is worth sitting with for a moment. Because if you arrived here already tired, not sleepy, but the other kind of tired, the kind where even the good parts of your week feel like they are happening slightly behind glass, then the actual explanation for those 3 women is more relevant to your Tuesday than any article about them has suggested. So let's go there directly. There's a longitudinal study out of Rush University in Chicago that tracked nearly 1,500 ordinary adults for more than 20 years. Not athletes, not the wealthy, people with bad knees and old arguments and histories they did not ask for. And the variable that predicted survival more cleanly than almost anything else, more than optimism, more than diet quality, larger in effect size than many pharmaceutical interventions, comparable to not smoking, was not happiness, not even social connection, though they measured those too, and sometimes second shelf. Her daughter-in-law has been trying to figure out exactly what it is for years. She moves slowly. She does not move like someone performing wellness. She moves like someone with the next thing to do. The accounts from people who have watched these women across decades are not about what they ate or how they slept, though those things are part of it. What comes through again and again is orientation. Each of them wakes up inside a life that has a direction, not grand purpose, nothing you'd put in an obituary's opening sentence. The garden that still needs someone who knows it. The grandchild who needs watching. The family story that would vanish if she stopped carrying it. Small things, repeated 10,000 times. Never abandoned. Between them, there's real loss. Spouses, children, siblings, the accumulated grief of outliving whole generations. There is poverty, physical labor, the specific hardness of rural life in mid-20th century Brazil without the infrastructure that softens it. Mornings that started in darkness, hands already cracked before 7. None of it was gentle. None of it was lucky. What it was consistently was pointed. The Rush data suggests that is not incidental to their survival. It may be the central variable. There's a distinction that the popular conversation about longevity almost always collapses, and it is worth naming carefully because it might be the one you need to hear right now. Purpose is not productivity, is not a full calendar or an ambitious agenda, or what we celebrate in culture as contribution. A person can be intensely productive and feel completely hollow. A person can live slowly, quietly, in a way that looks like nothing from the outside, and carry inside them an orientation so complete that the body never has to strain against uncertainty about why it is still running. What the data is measuring is direction, the felt sense of moving towards something that matters to you, even if that something is simply the next morning. When that feeling is present, the autonomic nervous system settles into a different resting tone. This is the mechanism that connects purpose to the body's actual repair capacity. Because an immune system that is not running a low-grade threat response has more resource for real work. Wound healing accelerates. Infection clearance improves. The overnight reconstitution that the body does when you are asleep runs more completely when the system is not already braced against a formless dread. The body that knows where it's going heals faster than the body that doesn't. That is not poetry. That is a finding with a p-value. Which means the next question is not philosophical. It is practical. If purpose functions as a biological variable, if it shows up in longitudinal mortality data the way a drug would, with a measurable dose-response relationship between how much of it you carry and how long the body sustains itself, then the question is not whether you need it. You already knew that. The question is how you build it or rebuild it when the thing you are oriented toward has gone quiet or worn thin or stopped pulling the way it used to. The sisters did not get their orientation from supplement protocol or a cold plunge or a tracking device on their wrist. They got it from something that sits underneath those tools and determines whether any of them actually work. Something closer to the layer where the body decides before you consciously decide whether this morning is worth the full biochemical investment. That layer is accessible. It responds to specific inputs. And the research on what those inputs are is more concrete and more usable than the headlines are reporting. That is exactly where we're going next. close your eyes for a second and think about the last time you walked into a kitchen that smelled like something had been simmering for hours and for decades without thinking much about it. That's the feeling that's been building for 6 chapters. You may not have named it yet, but it's been accumulating the way wood smoke accumulates in wool. Not an event, just a condition, being a choice, and became the temperature of the place. That's what they share, not a protocol, not a morning sequence they followed for a season and then let go when life got complicated. Something that's been running underneath, the way a river keeps running underneath ice in winter. You can't always see it. The biology can. Let me tell you where the money has been going, because it tells you something important about what the money cannot find. There's a real industry built around the idea of living longer, and it is not small, and it is not simply wrong. Global longevity market valuations crossed $600 billion in recent projections. Venture capital has been moving into this space with the particular urgency of people who understand something personal about time. The interventions being funded are almost universally external. Senolytic compounds designed to clear aging cells from tissue. Continuous glucose monitors worn on the arm. Oxygen-enriched chambers. Intravenous infusions. Genetic panels returning risk data on predispositions going out 3 decades. These are serious things. Some of them are producing genuinely interesting findings in controlled settings. None of that is being waved away here. But the architecture of the industry rests on an assumption that is worth naming out loud. It assumes that aging is primarily structural. Something that happens to the body the way weather happens to a building, an accumulation of damage, a depletion of resources, a degradation of parts, and therefore something that can be interrupted from the outside in. Find the deficiency, correct it. Find the accumulation, clear it. Find the deteriorating system, support it with a precisely engineered input. The logic is clean, and it maps onto everything we already believe about medicine. The body is a machine, the physician's role is the mechanic's role, and the mechanic's job is to restore function. That model has produced extraordinary things. Nobody is arguing otherwise. But here is where the data on extreme longevity starts to create friction. When researchers look seriously at individuals who reach not just old age, but vigorous old age, functioning past 90, oriented, emotionally present, sometimes sharp in ways that embarrass people half their age. The consistent finding is not that they had better external interventions. Researchers at UC San Diego studying Centenarian cognitive function found that subjects had displayed low scores on measures of anxiety and neuroticism across their lifespans, not as a momentary state, as a durable signature in how they related to circumstances year after year. Italian researchers tracking longevity families in remote southern villages found that what distinguished the longest-lived individuals wasn't diet alone or movement alone, but a kind of psychological coherence, a consistency between what they valued and how they actually spent their days, that appeared to function as a sustained regulatory influence on inflammatory biology. A paper in Psychological Science examining multiple longitudinal cohorts found that individuals scoring high on what researchers called eudaimonic well-being showed measurably different patterns in gene expression related to inflammatory response, not as a temporary state, as a pattern that held. The body, it turns out, is reading something deeper than the inputs on the invoice. And here's where the gap becomes visible. Not a gap born of bad intentions. A structural gap, the kind that forms when your instruments are more sensitive in one direction than another. You can measure a biomarker. You can quantify a supplement dose. You can track glucose every few minutes and feel, justifiably, that you're doing something rigorous and real. That feeling of rigor isn't entirely wrong, but there is no device you strap to your wrist to measure the sustained quality of your internal orientation. Whether the emotional weather inside you runs chronic and low and defended across years, or whether something steadier has been cultivated there, something that doesn't meet every perturbation with the full biological cost of a threat response, that doesn't get measured in the same clean way, so it doesn't get funded in the same clean way. The selling has run ahead of the proving, enormously, and the result is a strange asymmetry. The interventions with the largest marketing infrastructure are the ones with the most external, purchasable, deliverable quality. The vials, the panels, the devices. And the evidence pointing toward internal state as a driver of longevity at the extreme end moves more quietly because it is harder to package and almost impossible to invoice. You can sell a person a supplement. You cannot sell them what those three sisters carry in the way they move through an ordinary afternoon. The way one of them stands at the counter long after the tea has gone cold, not anxious about it, just there. That asymmetry isn't a conspiracy. It's just the shape of an industry operating inside an economy. What generates returns is what can be delivered and reordered. An internal condition sustained across decades doesn't fit that model. The sisters don't have something they found somewhere and purchased. They have something they are. And somewhere in that distinction between having and being is where $600 billion quietly runs out of road. Sit with that for a moment because it actually changes something in how you read the landscape. Once you feel where the industry stops, you stop scanning for the product that will finally arrive and close the gap. You stop waiting. You start looking somewhere else entirely, at the quality of the states you sustain across time. Not your peak states. Those are easy to engineer and easy to sell. Your baseline. What does the emotional terrain inside you feel like on a Tuesday with nothing remarkable happening, no optimization in progress, no one watching? Because the biology, it appears, is listening to that. It is taking notes not on your best moments, but on your average ones. Not on the week you did everything right, but on the accumulated texture of how you hold your life when the kitchen is quiet and the tea is cold, and there's simply nothing to perform. That is what the sisters have been holding all along. And it turns out, the thing worth understanding how to cultivate. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and garlic before the researchers even sat down. One sister was already talking. Another was already laughing at something. It became clear, after a few minutes, that the thing she was laughing at had been funny in this family for 60 years, and the laugh still had the same shape. A third reached across the table and touched her sister's hand, not as a gesture, not as comfort, just as a reflex, the way you'd adjust your own collar without thinking. The researchers had come with metabolic panels, inflammatory markers, cognitive assessments, grip strength protocols. They had expected a biological anomaly. What they found instead made several of them uncomfortable because it didn't fit the template of anything publishable. It wasn't in the blood work. It was in the room. These three women, Dora, Dalva, and Dulcimar, were not managing their lives. They were inhabiting them. That distinction matters more than it sounds. And it is, in the end, the thing the longevity industry has never been able to bottle, because you cannot put it in a bottle. You cannot patent belonging. You cannot charge a quarterly subscription fee for meaning. You cannot manufacture continuity of purpose in a facility that requires FDA oversight. What these women had wasn't hidden by conspiracy. It was ignored by a system oriented entirely toward things it could commodify. The shelves are full. The secret was never on them. Stay with where we are. In the 1970s, a medical sociologist named Aaron Aronofsky was working backward from a puzzle that bothered him. He was studying survivors of extreme adversity, including people who had passed through concentration camps, and he kept finding that some of them had not deteriorated physiologically the way the research said they should have. Not in the motivational poster sense of resilience, where people smile through hardship. Something more structural, more bodily. He wanted to know what it was. He didn't find it in genetics or metabolism. He found it in the way certain people experience their own existence. Not whether life was pleasant, whether it held together, whether what happened to them could be understood, whether they had the resources to meet it, and whether any of it mattered in a world that extended beyond their own edges. He called this sense of coherence, and then the studies began accumulating. High coherence correlates with lower all-cause mortality, with preserved immune function, with slower cognitive decline, with reduced levels of the kind of systemic inflammation that doesn't spike and resolve, the kind that settles in a tissue like a tenant who stops paying rent and never leaves. The decades of data kept pointing at a state, not a supplement. A quality of inner organization that expressed itself measurably in how bodies aged and whether they repaired themselves. The longevity industry has spent 30 years trying to produce those outcomes through photobiomodulation, peptide stacks, and cold exposure. Antonovsky was describing the terrain those interventions are trying to approximate. He wasn't selling access to it. He was naming it. Which brings us back to the kitchen in Minas Gerais and what the researchers were circling without quite naming. What they observed in those three sisters, the belonging, the humor with 60 years of sediment in it, the hand touched without looking, is not separate from their physiology. It isn't a warm footnote to the biological data. It is the biological data seen through a different instrument. The internal state those women have sustained across a century is not incidental to the fact that their bodies kept repairing themselves. The state and the repair are the same phenomenon. If you've been paying attention to your own body across 4, 5, 6 decades of living, you already know what I'm describing. You felt the difference between a season when things held together and the years that felt like managed fragmentation. You know what the inside of coherence feels like. You know what it feels like when it's gone. What may not have been clear is that those two states aren't moods. They are measurable biological environments. Different gene expression, different inflammatory load, different rates of cellular maintenance. When researchers measure vagal tone, heart rate variability, cortisol rhythms, cytokine profiles, they're describing, in the vocabulary of instruments, something you've already experienced in the vocabulary of a life. When physicists describe a resonant system, two strings tuned to the same frequency, one vibrating, causing the other to vibrate without contact, they're not talking about anything mystical. They are describing the physical behavior of energy in organized matter. What the sisters in Minas Gerais are doing, what Ananovsky survivors were doing, what every long-term study of exceptional aging keeps arriving at sideways, is maintaining a sustained internal frequency, not as metaphor, as measurable state. The instruments keep describing the same thing in different vocabularies. Heart rate variability, cortical coherence on EEG, inflammatory cytokine patterns, vagal tone. Each vocabulary arrives at the same coordinates. The vocabulary that uses the word frequency isn't less scientific. It's older, and it has been mapping the same territory from a different direction for a very long time. You don't have to choose which map to trust. Both are pointing the same ground. Here is what that means then, not as theory, but as a question with weight in it. If the internal state those women have maintained is not separate from their biology, but continuous with it, then the usual framework for thinking about health, the one organized around inputs, interventions, and optimization, is not wrong so much as incomplete. It describes what happens at the edges of the system without addressing the system itself, the frequency that the biology is running on. And the question that follows, the one worth sitting with, not just reading past, is not whether this is true. The data is in. The question is what it changes about the way you are actually living right now. Not the life you're monitoring, not the life you're trying to fix, the one that happens while you're doing all of that. That is the question this chapter opens. The ground beneath it is older and more solid than anything the shelves are currently offering you. You already know the feeling, that tightness that arrives before you've finished reading the headline. The low-grade dread that settles into the chest somewhere between the alarm going off and the first sip of coffee. The way your jaw is already clenched before you've said a single word to anyone. That's where this needs to start. Not with the concept. With that, there's a story that landed recently out of a small municipality in Minas Gerais. 3 sisters, the youngest of them 94, the oldest 101, all 3 still living in the same house where they were born, on the same unpaved street their father walked, tended by the same community that had watched them grow from girls into old women. A local health team had come to document them for a regional aging study. What they found wasn't remarkable in the way miracles are remarkable. It was quieter than that. The sisters moved slowly but without pain. They slept through the night. Their blood work showed inflammation markers at levels you'd expect in healthy women 30 years younger. They cooked their own meals. They argued, apparently, with some regularity and considerable passion. When asked about their health, the oldest one paused and said she had never spent much time thinking about it. Then she went back to shelling beans. The researchers wrote it up carefully, cautiously, in the language of outliers. But the data underneath the language was not cautious at all. Something in the texture of those 100 years had kept these women's bodies from doing what most bodies do, which is to slowly, incrementally quietly accelerate away from health in response to a world that treats the nervous system as a permanent emergency. That is the thing worth understanding, not as a lecture, as a fact with consequences for the person watching this right now. The body keeps a kind of continuous account of its situation, not in words, not in thoughts, below all of that, in a register that predates language by millions of years. The question it is always asking is a simple one. Is it safe here? And the answer to that question, updated thousands of times per day by everything the senses take in, determines what the body does with its resources, whether it repairs or braces, whether it maintains or mobilizes, whether the cells patrolling for early damage get to do their job, or get reassigned to readiness for a conflict that never arrives. When the answer to that question is, most of the time, across most of a lifetime, something close to yes, the body behaves like a garden. Maintenance runs. Repair happens. The immune system does what it was designed to do before it got conscripted into chronic vigilance. The sisters had that. They had it not as a retreat or a practice or a decision they made in midlife. They had it as the unbroken background condition of 100 years. Two things built it, and they're not complicated. The first is belonging, not the sentimental kind, the structural kind. The body tracks, without any conscious involvement, whether you are embedded in something larger than yourself, whether other people know you exist and care that you do, whether your presence in the world is witnessed across time by the same people who knew you before you were whoever you've become. When those answers come back yes, without effort, as settled background fact, the threat detection system quiets. Not completely, it never fully disarms, but it stops running at the elevated baseline that most people have come to mistake for normal. The sisters were known. They were called by the names their mother gave them. The neighbors remembered them young. That continuity of witness, being known across decades by the same people in the same place, does something measurable to the body. It is not about the number of friends. It is about the few people who hold your whole story and are still in the room for it. The second is simpler to describe, something that needed them today, not a purpose in the grand, curated sense. A garden that required watering. A grandchild who would notice if they didn't show up. A neighbor who counted on Tuesday. The body responds to this kind of quiet necessity differently than it responds to ambition or obligation. It settles into a productive middle state, not bored, not panicked, present. That register, sustained day after day across a long life, is not a feeling. It's a physiology. The sisters had both of these things in duration. And duration is the operative word. The body doesn't respond primarily to peaks and valleys, to the exceptional good day or the awful week. It responds to what is average, what is chronic, what is the ground level frequency of lived experience, day after ordinary day, for decades. Which brings us to what erodes it. And this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable enough that it's worth slowing down for. Think about the first 15 minutes of your morning. The room is still dark or just lightning. The body is still warm from sleep, still moving slowly, the coffee not yet ready. And before any of that has fully settled, before you've heard a human voice, before the day has any texture at all, the phone is already delivering the world's emergencies directly into your hands. The architecture of that delivery was not designed carelessly. The push notification, the red banner, the scroll that never resolves. These were built with precise knowledge of how the brain responds to the signal of significance. The nervous system pauses for anything that registers as potentially threatening. That pause is ancient, involuntary, and indiscriminate. It does not ask whether the danger is in the room or on a screen. It does not ask whether you have any power over what's happening. It fires and the body responds, and that response costs something from the body's maintenance budget every single time. Once it costs nothing measurable, 100 times across a year, it begins to accumulate. Across a decade, it shows. Not as a dramatic collapse, but as a slow drift, a gradual recalibration of what the nervous system treats as its normal resting state. Because it happens in such small increments, it never announces itself as a problem. It becomes the water you swim in, the ambient temperature of the interior, the background tension you've stopped noticing because it's been there long enough that you've mistaken it for your personality. The sisters received news the way their generation received it, in doses, through people they trusted, already metabolized by conversation before it landed as settled understanding. By the time something reached them and became part of how they held the world, it had been filtered through the voices of people who knew them and who themselves had sat with it long enough to put it in some kind of proportion. It arrived as information, not as a physical emergency requiring immediate response from a body that had no actual way to respond. What arrives in your phone before the coffee is ready is something structurally different. It is raw signal, real-time, unmediated, designed to feel urgent. And it reaches the nervous system before the social buffers are available, before the body is warmed into the day, before anything is in place that would allow it to be received as information rather than alarm. The sisters never had to negotiate this. Their 100 years of evidence was built on a different information diet, inside a different relationship with urgency, in a different kind of daily quiet. Here's what that means practically. The internal state is not fixed. It is being calibrated constantly by what the nervous system takes in and treats as a description of reality. The sister's state was calibrated across a lifetime by belonging, by necessity, by community, by information that arrived already humanized. Yours is being calibrated in part by something that was built to keep you physiologically activated, because activation drives attention, and attention is what gets sold. That is not a reason to feel defeated. A calibration that has drifted can be corrected. That is actually the point. But you can only correct something once you can see it clearly. And most people can't see this one yet because it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like being informed. It feels like staying awake to the world. It feels, after enough years of it, like just the way mornings are. The sisters would not recognize that feeling, and their cells, at 101, reflect the difference. Here is what has been eroding you, not the headlines. What happened in your body the moment before you read them. You already know this as a physical fact, not a concept. The notification arrives. Before your eyes focus on the words, something moves in the jaw, a slight forward press of the molars, automatic, unconscious, the way you'd press your foot toward a brake pedal you're not yet touching. The shoulders rise a quarter inch. The breath shallows. By the time the first sentence lands, your body has already issued a verdict. Hostile. The cortex catches up later. The chemistry moved first. That is the thing that has been quietly grinding you down. Not the geopolitical event, not the economic number, not the foreign policy failure. The position you arrive in, the state already running when the information enters. The bracing that happens before the blow lands and then stays long after the screen goes dark. This morning, specifically, the story that most people in this country woke up to was the kind that justifies that bracing. A federal oversight body disbanded by executive order at midnight. No public comment period. No transition plan. The agencies it supervised, environmental permitting, workplace safety compliance, financial disclosure review, are now operating without the coordination structure they've used for 11 years. The people inside those agencies don't yet know what this means for their ongoing caseloads. Some are describing it as procedural. Others are calling it a structural rupture. Both things appear to be true at once, which is its own kind of exhausting. That is the honest news. Sit with it for a moment, actually, not braced, not already composing a reaction, just receiving it, the way you receive weather, noting it, letting it register, not yet deciding what it demands from you. Because what it demands from you is the question that determines almost everything about how you'll carry this day. There are 3 women living in a rural township in Minas Gerais, deep in the Brazilian interior, where the afternoons still smell of red clay dust and wood smoke and overripe fruit baking on the vine, who are each older than 100 years and still walking their own land without assistance. The researchers who visit them arrive looking for a gene, a diet, a biomarker that explains what they are. They take blood samples in the heat of a kitchen with a cracked tile floor. They ask questions about what the women eat, how many hours they sleep. The women answer patiently, a little amused. What the researchers have not yet found an instrument to measure is the thing that is actually most visible if you sit with these women for an afternoon. Watch one of them receive difficult news, the death of a neighbor, a grandchild's illness, word that the rains are coming late again. The face changes. The grief or the worry arrives fully, genuinely, without performance. But the body does not lock. The jaw does not press forward and hold. The shoulders do not migrate upward and then stay there for 6 hours while the news cycles. The emotion moves through them the way the afternoon cloud cover moves, present, real, and then released into the next moment, into whatever task the hands were already doing. You can actually watch this happen. The body receives the weight and then, without drama, sets it back down. Yours does not do this. Mine did not do this either for most of my life. The training that made it otherwise was slow and unremarkable. 1,000 repetitions of the same sequence. Alarming input, physical bracing, partial resolution, incomplete release. Do that enough times, and bracing becomes the resting state. The body stops waiting for the alarm and simply stays armed. That is not anxiety in the clinical sense. That is the body doing exactly what it was taught to do by the environment it lived in, adapting efficiently and faithfully to what it concluded the world required. The question no researcher has yet sat down to ask those 3 women is not what they eat or what they inherit. The question is, what do they practice every single day without ever knowing it was practice? The answer, reconstructed from everything we now know about how the body regulates itself, is return, not avoidance. They feel difficulty completely, with their whole faces without flinching, but then they return to the breath, to the texture of the afternoon, to the immediate, to the resolvable, to the thing the hands are already doing. They do not rehearse the difficulty forward into tomorrow or narrate it into a permanent condition of the world. They receive it, and then they release the receiving. That is a practice. It can be learned, not abstractly in the body through repetition, the same way the bracing was learned. Here is the first thing you can do today without buying anything, without requiring silence you don't have. Before you open any news source in the morning, before the screen, before the headlines, breathe in through the nose for 4 counts. Hold for 4 counts. Breathe out through the nose for 6 counts. Do this for 2 minutes. That asymmetry, the longer exhale, is not incidental. It is the signal your body has been waiting for. The threat has receded. You are allowed to stop spending energy on vigilance. The information that comes after enters a body that is no longer braced. It lands differently, not because you've gone numb, but because you've arrived capable. The sisters never did this as a named practice. They simply breathed the way a body breathes when it hasn't spent 40 years rehearsing alarm. The protocol is a return to something the body already knows. The second thing costs nothing and produces nothing measurable in the first 30 seconds, which is exactly why it will be hard to trust. 10 minutes of deliberate silence, not the absence of sound. The birds in Minas Gerais are extraordinarily loud, and the wooden chairs creak, and that's fine. Deliberate silence means no informational input requiring response. No podcast, no Instagram, no screen glancing back at you from the counter. Just the body existing without being asked to process anything new. In that gap, something happens that cannot happen while the inputs are running. Consolidation. The brain completes the emotional loop that the news story left open when it ended without resolution. You move from received to finished. The story about the disbanded oversight body is still true. Nothing about the silence makes it less true, but you will stop carrying it in your jaw. The third thing is the most radical because it looks the most like nothing. Your attention is the most consequential instrument you have, and right now is probably running on default. Whatever you attend to at length, the brain builds infrastructure around, pathways, retrieval shortcuts, chemical responses. Spend 3 hours each evening with geopolitical collapse and institutional failure, and the brain builds a very fast highway to that state. It starts to feel like the truth of the world, because it is the truth the brain has worked hardest to make accessible. The 3 women in Minas Gerais have given their attention over a century predominantly to the immediate, the tactile, and the resolvable, not because they are simple or sheltered, but because their days asked them to tend to what was in front of their hands. The attention stayed local. The body stayed local with it. They are not uninformed. They are not indifferent. They are finished when they are finished. You can choose, as an act of precision, not escape, to read the news once, fully, without looking away from it, and then to close it and return your attention to the room you're actually in, the body you're actually living in, the afternoon that is actually happening around you. Not pretending the larger story doesn't exist. Simply refusing to let it colonize every hour that follows the reading. That is what the women in Minas Gerais have done for 100 years. They received what was real, and then they set it down and picked up whatever was next. The clay dust on the path. The overripe smell of the afternoon. The hands, still useful, still here. You can do this today. The path back to your own body is shorter than it feels from inside the bracing. That is not where this ends. It is where you start. There's a specific kind of morning dread that nobody warns you about. Not the sharp kind, not the jolt of an alarm or the spike before something you know is coming. This is the other kind, the low kind, the one that is already sitting in your chest before you've identified a single reason for it, before you've spoken a word, before the day has technically started. Just a faint tightening somewhere below the sternum that arrived without announcement and doesn't explain itself. If you know that feeling, and if you're honest, you probably do, this chapter is for you. And the first thing worth saying is that tightening is not weakness. It is not anxiety in a clinical sense, and it is not a character flaw, and it is not evidence that you are handling things badly. It is a biological response to a pattern your body has been trained inside of slowly, over years, without your permission and without anyone explaining what was happening to the tissue while it learned. That matters. Hold on to it. On the morning of March 14th, a cargo vessel ran aground in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, briefly choking a route that carries approximately 12% of global oil shipments. Within 4 hours, crude futures moved. Within 6, the story had migrated from shipping industry feeds to mainstream breaking news banners in 17 countries. By 7 in the morning in most of the Western Hemisphere, it was arriving as a notification on a nightstand, a bolded headline in a red banner for words, the kind that the algorithm has learned will make the chest do exactly what yours is doing now, before you have read a single sentence of context. That is a real event. It deserved real coverage, and the coverage it received was not wrong. Exactly. It was just framed the way everything gets framed now. As a leading edge of catastrophe, a harbinger, the thing before the worst thing. The story was real. The dread it was engineered to produce was something else entirely. And the reason that distinction matters, the reason it matters to your body, specifically today, is this. Your autonomic nervous system does not read past the headline. It responds to pattern. And if the pattern for years has been morning plus screen plus alarming information, then the body has already been trained. It knows what comes next. It starts the cascade before the story even loads. The jaw tightens. The shoulders inch forward a degree or two. Not dramatically, not the way people describe panic. Just a quiet bracing, the body saying, "Noted, stand by." And then you put the phone down and start the day, and the bracing never fully releases. That is not metaphor. That is your inflammatory response, your sleep architecture, your nervous system's sense of what neutral feels like, all of it being quietly recalibrated, one morning at a time, to a baseline that is higher than it should be, higher than it was built to sustain, high enough that genuine rest has started to feel somewhere in the back of the mind like irresponsibility. A daily pattern of input that the nervous system could use to stay below the threshold, to keep the baseline from drifting upward until high There's a particular kind of tiredness that isn't about sleep. You know the one. It lives in the upper back on a Tuesday afternoon when nothing specific has gone wrong. It's in the flatness that settles after a week of heavy news, even though your own life is unchanged. It's the sleep that doesn't fully repair, the morning that arrives already slightly behind. You have felt it as a physical fact, not a concept, a low, persistent hum in the body that says something is off, even when you cannot say what. That feeling is not a personal failure. It is a signal, and it is exactly where this story has been pointing since the moment we first set foot on that property and heard Zilda's boots on the dry earth before the sun came up. Because the question that has been forming, the one that doesn't announce itself, just settles in the way a splinter does, is whether any of what these three women have is actually available to you. Whether Zilda, Selena, and Lourdes were simply dealt a different hand at the moment of conception. Whether the food, the pace, the silence, the unhurried way they moved through a hard world. Whether all of it was just decoration on a foundation nobody else could pour. The answer is no. But I want to come at that no from the right direction, because the wrong direction leads people to a self-help promise I am not making. What the researchers found, and what took them months to articulate carefully, because careful is how science works when it isn't being summarized for a headline, was not a single variable. Not one gene, not one food, not one village custom that explained three women crossing 100 years while most of their generation did not. What they found was a pattern, a consistency of inputs that the body, over time, began to expect. An expectation at the cellular level is not metaphor. It is instruction. The body reads direction, not individual moments. It reads the vector of your days, not any single data point within them. Think about what that means in practical terms. In your body, right now. A single poor night's sleep does not break an accumulation of good ones. A single clean meal does not recalibrate years of anxious eating. But the reverse is equally true. And this is the part that most coverage of these sisters either missed or buried near the end. A single poor choice does not break the accumulation either. The body is reading the pattern, always the pattern, which means the pattern is always still writable. Zilda is not a woman who was protected from difficulty. Her 100 years held a government she didn't choose, a husband she buried, children who moved to cities that felt like foreign countries. She knew what grief tasted like, the specific weight of it, the way it sits in the chest in the early morning when the light is still gray and thin and the house is quiet in the wrong way. She knew the feeling at the back of the throat at 2 in the morning when the dark is complete and the mind offers nothing but inventory. She was not shielded from the weight of living. She moved through it differently. Stan ran the other direction, which means the question is not There's a moment somewhere in the middle of all of this when the question stops being about the sisters. You've spent the last hour or so inside their lives, inside the smell of black beans cooking low on a wood stove, inside the sound of Portuguese prayers said from memory in the dark, inside the texture of hands that have touched 80 years of the same red earth. And somewhere along the way, without anyone announcing it, the question shifted. It stopped being, what did they do? And it became, what do I already have? That's the loop we left open earlier, and I want to close it now. Not with a list, not with a supplement stack, not with a protocol. With something simpler and harder to argue with. You already possess the same raw material they worked with. Not their soil, not their prayers, not their specific village or their specific bloodline. But the thing underneath all of that, the capacity to regulate how you receive the world. The sisters didn't live long because the world was gentle with them. Brazil in the 20th century was not gentle. Poverty was not gentle. Loss was not gentle. They lived long because something in the way they processed what reached them emotionally, biologically, relationally, never allowed the weight of external events to become a permanent internal condition. Watch what they actually did. Each morning, before the day had a chance to name itself, they made a decision about what it was going to feel like. Not denial, not performance, something more like a posture, the way you settle your weight before you lift something heavy. They still after 20 minutes of it than they did before. That's not weakness. That's a calibrated response to a system engineered to produce exactly that response at scale. Inputs have actually been costing you. Not on a lab panel, not on a scan. In the slower, less measurable places, the quality of the hour after you put the phone down, the weight behind the sternum at 2 in the afternoon, the distance between how you feel when you wake up and how you feel by mid-morning. Those numbers don't appear anywhere, but they accumulate the same way the sisters' mornings accumulated, quietly, over years, into something that either holds you up or hollows you out. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer, but it has a useful one, and that's where we're going next. There's a moment, It happens before full wakefulness, before the first words spoken aloud, before coffee or light or the ordinary sounds of a house coming back to life. A small sound, a chime, a buzz, a specific tap of vibration against the nightstand. It carries no information yet. It is pure signal, unread, still arriving. And in the 2 or 3 seconds before the screen lights, something shifts in you. Not a thought, a state, a faint tightening behind the sternum, breath moving shallower than it was a moment ago, a readiness oriented toward threat, because that is what 1,000 previous mornings trained your body to prepare for. The sound itself has already become the news. No headline has loaded. No story has appeared, but your chemistry has already responded, already tilted, already begun the cascade that will color everything you encounter next. We asked this at the start. What does that notification do in the body before you read a word? Here is the complete answer. It does whatever your state allows it to do. If you arrive at that sound already contracted, already running on a nervous system that spent yesterday and the day before interpreting the world as a sequence of threats to survive, then the sound lands in that field and extends it. The story you read next is received by a body already in a posture of defense. Information passes through a filter set to danger. The day builds from there, not from the news itself, from the condition in which you met it. If you arrive at that sound carrying something different, not a manufactured calm, not performance, not a fragile optimism assembled before breakfast, but an actual cultivated groundedness, a body that has been given what it needs to process difficulty without being rearranged by it, then the same sound lands in different soil. The same headline, the same event, the same world. Received by a different instrument, it produces a different note. This is not metaphor. The physiology is real. The state you bring to information is not decoration around the content. It is the mechanism by which content becomes experience. You don't form a thought about the news and then have a physical response. The physical response arrives first, shapes the thought, and the thought becomes your reality of that morning, of that day, of the accumulation of days. Change what arrives at that threshold, and you change what a life is gradually constructed from. Now consider 3 women, sisters, featured at the opening of this conversation, who lived well past 100 years in a small community in a country that remade itself several times around them. They were not wealthy. The century they passed through was not gentle. Poverty, grief, the specific weight of things that cannot be changed. The world pressed on them as it presses on everyone. They received the news of their era. They received hardship. They received loss, and something in them did not break. Not because they were protected from difficulty. They weren't. But the texture of how they lived, meals prepared without rushing, grief held inside community rather than inside solitude. A sense that the body is not a machine to be optimized, but a presence to be inhabited. Something in that texture created a continuity that the noise of a century could not interrupt. They moved through long lives without the daily cost of constant threat readiness hollowing them out from the inside. They didn't outlive the world they lived in. They lived through it and remained, underneath it all, recognizably themselves. That is what this entire conversation has been pointing toward. Not a supplement, not a protocol, not a number on a panel or a score on a readiness ring. A cultivated state, practiced across ordinary days, built in small and unsexy increments, that meets each morning's difficulty without being destabilized by it. Science is studying the sisters now, looking at their meals, their microbiomes, their sleep, their genetics. It will find things. Those findings will matter. But the mechanism underneath the mechanism, the one that precedes all the measurable markers, is the quality of presence they brought to each day's threshold. Here is what that means in practical terms, stated plainly. The state you carry into each moment is the medium through which every moment passes. Not in some abstract philosophical sense, in the literal, embodied, daily sense that a nervous system running on chronic low-grade threat processes every experience through that lens, and a nervous system, given what it needs to remain regulated, processes the same experience and arrives somewhere different. Same world, different instrument, different note. Over a decade, over 3 decades, over a life, the difference in what it costs you to be alive accumulates into something enormous. That state is available now, not once the news quiets. The news does not quiet. It is replaced by other news, and the question was never about the news. Not after the world becomes less demanding. The world does not become less demanding. The question has always been narrower and more immediate than any of that. It is about you in the silence before the screen lights, hearing the sound before the word arrives, and what you have built across mornings and practices and small repeated choices that determines who you are in that moment. That is where the leverage is. That is where it has always been.